Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Bands You Should Know. Let's travel back to 1988. If you remember, in 1988, thrash metal was pretty much at its peak. It was getting super popular. There were shitloads of thrash bands coming out of the woodwork. And also in 1988, you had new albums from all four of the bands that would become known as the Big Four of thrash. You had Injustice for All, you had South of Heaven, you had So Far So Good So What, and you had State of Euphoria. How could I fucking forget that one? What the fuck? But anyway, so there was a lot going on in thrash metal. And so you could see how maybe it would have been kind of easy for a smaller band to kind of get buried under all the shit that was going on. And one of those bands is what we're going to talk about today. And their debut album came out in 1988. And that band is called Acrophet. So, Acrophet were formed in Wisconsin around the mid-80s. And they were some pretty young dudes. In fact, they were all around 17 or 18 years old when they released their first album, Corrupt Minds, on XXX Records. This album came out in 1988. This album is filled with fast and aggressive thrash metal, almost bordering on crossover thrash, especially in the vocal department. But for a group of very young dudes, this shit is pretty fucking badass. It's, like I said, it's really fast. It almost seems like they're trying to play as fast as they can through most of the album. And there's some interesting riffs and there's some, abrupt tempo changes. And surprisingly, they all kind of keep it together, even though, it really feels like it's about to go off the rails at any time through the entire album. So, hey, how about we listen to a little bit of it?
What is the world trying to talk to you? You're making any sense for the video. Doesn't make a difference, doesn't matter anyway. Lost something out in the edge, you're gonna
Here we have the inner sleeve with pictures of the dudes, and we'll just take a look at the vinyl over this. Nothing special, but you got your XXX logo on there. So anyway, so what you heard is a very good example of how pretty much the whole album sounds. There's no new ground broken here. You can kind of understand why they may have been buried underneath a lot of other shit going on in 1988. But for a band of kids as young as they were, this is a pretty fucking killer debut album. And the next album they put out only improved on the sound that they started on Corrupt Minds. So through Corrupt Minds, they did gain some attention and a little bit of praise. And then in 1990, they released their second album, Faded Glory. Now this, if you look, this has the hype sticker still on it. So let's look at some shit that was being said about this band.
The second unique concoction of intelligent speedcore from Acrophet, following their highly praised 1988 debut, Corrupt Minds. Boasting an attitude, Faded Glory fires 11 rounds of short, sharp shock treatment with all the impact as a nail gun against the skull, from Bob Climo of Metal Forces. Not since the Twin Tone invasion a few years back has a band been simultaneously aware and exciting. Good old Richard Davis T from Music Connection. And we have, with Acrophet's clever lyrics, deft guitar work, and powerful rhythms, any metal fan would be hard-pressed to find a more engrossing collection of thrashers anywhere. That's Ron Harper from Hit Parader. That's pretty good praise right there. Anyway.
As bands do with their second albums, they matured here. It is a more sort of controlled sounding album. It's still very fast thrash metal. They've lost a little bit of the crossover edge. It's a little bit more straightforward, but it seems like they're progressing their sound a little bit. They seem more confident. They seem like dudes who have kind of figured out what they want to sound like, and this is probably, I would guess, their best representation of what they were actually going for. So this one just has an insert instead of an actual inner sleeve, but you know, there you go. And the label of the record is pretty much exactly the same as the last one. So in my opinion, this album is superior to Corrupt Minds, but they both kind of have their own individual charms. And sadly, after this album was released, the band did start working on some new material, but then ended up breaking up. And it kind of sucks because, you know, at the time, there was so much thrash going on. There were hundreds of great thrash bands. I might be overestimating, but there were a shitload. But to be fair, these two albums, they stand up with a lot of those classics from that time period. And I do feel like this band had an opportunity to progress their sound and maybe even become more badass than they already were. But for whatever reasons, everything just kind of fell apart, as it does with bands. So there is a little bit of information online. They have a Facebook page and it kind of has a bio. And from what I gather, for the most part, these guys just sort of walked away from metal. So you have a couple of dudes who seem like they're doctors or some shit, living pretty well. Other guys still doing music, very much not metal. So it's interesting because out of all the bands so far that I've done a video on that are not together currently, this one seems like the one where there's no chance. All we got are these two albums from Acrophet, and that is it. And what's even worse, you can't find these things on fucking Spotify or Apple Music. You could probably search YouTube and find full album streams or whatever. But they're just a band that sort of existed in this little time period. And then that was it. That's all you get. But clearly, if the band fell apart and then everyone sort of moved away from metal, I kind of get that their hearts probably weren't completely in it. And maybe this is as good as it was going to get. But it's pretty damn good. These albums are totally fucking enjoyable. And like I said before, they stand up there with all that great thrash metal that came out in the late 80s. So if you have a chance, I highly recommend going and searching online for the albums, or just go search and see if you can pick yourself up a copy like I did, because they're just classic thrash metal, and you know how much I love that, and I'm assuming a lot of you do too. Anyway, there you go. Acrophet, another band you should know, and now you do. I will see you guys again next time.